So first of all, I just wanted to remind you guys that next week we will have farmer poet Scott Chasky reading for us and speaking to us about how he makes his life as both poet and farmer. So please come to that, 7 o'clock next Wednesday. As always, like us on Facebook at Writers Speak Wednesday. Follow us on Twitter at Writers Speak Wednesday. So I have one sort of sad announcement, which is that David Margolick is ill and will not be reading tonight, and we'll try to reschedule him for some other time, and we wish him a speedy recovery. But we're still delighted to welcome Michael Shnayerson to our podium, and he is going to be reading from a book that he wrote with Harry Belafonte called My Song, and then he will be speaking about the writer's life a la Michael Shnayerson. So we really look forward to hearing from you. So welcome, Michael.
Well, David is a good friend of mine, and he called me this morning and said, "I feel really guilty." I said, "Don't feel guilty. Well, he'll come back and you'll have a whole evening of him, which is better than only getting half an evening of him tonight." So Susie suggested maybe I start by reading. I must say I don't like to read for too long. I don't like it when writers read for a long time. I think it's better to talk and eventually have questions. But she said that reading the first chapter of this book might be helpful to giving you a sense of explanatory of kind of how one decides what to do with the first chapter, and what this first chapter does, I think, for this book. So I'll read it. It's about 8 pages, and then I'll talk about it. So this is the first chapter of the memoir that I wrote with Harry Belafonte over the last couple of years, and as you will see, it's not the first chapter of his life, in fact, it's what I would call the money chapter. And the money chapter is what publishers refer to as an opening chapter, because you got to hook the reader, and if you don't hook the reader, he won't pay you the money. So the fun of this chapter to me is that I realized when he started talking about it at some point, not first interview, but probably the 20th interview, that this was clearly the money chapter, and not only because it was very dramatic, because it was actually about money. So, here it is. The phone rang late in the evening in my New York apartment. It was the night of August 4th, 1964, a night of grief and anger for all of us in the civil rights movement, but especially those in Mississippi. "We've got a crisis on our hands down here," the young man on the line said. "We need help." At the start of that fateful summer, hundreds of volunteers, most of them students, many of them white, all of them knowing how dangerous the work would be, had come down from northern universities to register black voters and support rural blacks in pursuit of their civil rights. They were fanning out along the front lines of a civil rights war, unarmed in a state of seething segregationists. Mississippi's police stood ready at the slightest pretext to beat them bloody and throw them in jail. The Ku Klux Klan might well do worse. That day, we all learned just how much worse. The bodies of 3 volunteers, missing since June 21st, had been found in a shallow grave near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, 2 of them white, 1 black, had been arrested on an alleged traffic violation, briefly jailed, then allowed to drive off after dark into a Ku Klux Klan ambush. All 3 had been beaten, then shot. Chaney, the black volunteer, had been tortured and mutilated. I'd helped raise a lot of money to launch Mississippi Freedom Summer. I called all the top entertainers I knew: Frank Sinatra, Lena Horne, Henry Fonda, Marlon Brando, Joan Baez, the Kingston Trio, Dick Gregory, and more, to ask that they give money directly or participate in benefit concerts. That money bought a lot of gas and cars, housing and food, but now more was needed, a lot more. The original plan had called for students to do 2-week shifts, then go home and be replaced by others. With the ominous disappearance of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman, every shift had insisted on staying. Now that the bodies have been found, all those volunteers voted to stay not just through summer, but into the fall as well. "It's good if they're staying," explained Jim Foreman, the young man who called me that night. Jim was the de facto head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of several civil rights groups down there. Because if they leave now, or even at the end of August, the Klan will say it intimidated them into going, and the press will play it that way. And if they all stay, we can get thousands of more voters registered. The problem is we don't have the resources to keep them all here. What do you need, I asked. At least $50,000. I told him I'd get it, one way or another. How soon do you need it? We're going to burn through the rest of our budget in 72 hours. Before he rang off, Foreman told me one other thing. This could get really ugly, he said quietly. I'm hearing a lot of people say enough is enough, to hell with nonviolence. They're taking up guns. I'm worried they're going to take matters into their own hands. I had to think hard about where that money might come from and how I might get it to Greenwood, Mississippi. I could tap my own savings for the whole $50,000. I'd written a check to SNCC for an amount not much smaller than that in its early days to help establish it, and others since then. For me, it was anything goes, but I owed it to my family to keep us financially safe. Paul Robeson, the extraordinary actor, singer, and activist, whose path I'd tried to follow my whole adult life, had given so much money to social causes that he'd left himself vulnerable to his enemies, chief among them the federal government, a formidable force led by J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, when he was blacklisted as a communist in the late 1940s. With Senator Joseph McCarthy riding shotgun, the federal government had cowed Carnegie Hall and other American venues into not hiring him, then seized his passport so that he couldn't earn a living performing abroad. Eventually, Paul ran through his savings and slid into a deep place of sadness. I never forgot that. Somehow, I'd have to raise most of the money from others, in 2 days, maybe 3. Then there was the matter of how that money would get to Mississippi. I couldn't just wire it and have a black civil rights activist go to the local Western Union office to ask for his $50,000, please. He'd be dead before he drove a mile away. So would a white-collared volunteer. As for banks, those fine institutions owned and operated by Mississippi's white power elite, no way. The money would have to be brought down in cash. And unless I could come up with some brighter idea, I'd have to take it down myself. My wife, Julie, started pulling together a New York fundraiser at our West End Avenue apartment. I flew to Chicago. Irv Kupnichet, as powerful a columnist in his city as Walter Winchell was in New York, gathered dozens of guests at his home on a day or two's notice. White guests bearing checkbooks. Why did I, as a black performer, have such sway with Irv and his friends? Our friendship traced back to my club circuit days as a young troubadour in the early 50s, but our personal history was just one part of it. Without quite knowing how I did it, I had some power to reach a hand across the racial divide. That, I knew, had as much to do with the moment as with me. Galvanized by the shocking news of the volunteers' murders, Irv's guests thrust cash and checks at me, $35,000 worth, as if I was the personal emissary of the civil rights movement, which in a way, in that place and on that evening, I was. After making a trip to Montreal, I had another $20,000. When I got back to New York, Julie and I took in $15,000 more from our own apartment fundraiser. Time was running out. I'd hoped to raise $100,000, but $70,000 would have to do. I felt pretty good about that sum of money. I felt even better now that I had a sidekick for the trip, my pal from our days together as struggling actors in Harlem, Sidney Poitier. Sidney and I were like brothers. Born within 8 days of each other, we shared the same West Indian heritage and the same burning desire to break out of grinding poverty. Incredibly, both of us had achieved our dreams as entertainers. Sidney was the top black actor in Hollywood. I'd found my first successes as a singer, but had gone on to my own share of Broadway and Hollywood triumphs. We were, to put it simply, the 2 top black male entertainers in the world. Like brothers, we were also fiercely competitive and had our differences, both political and personal. For starters, Sidney was a lot more cautious than I was. "What kind of protection are you going to have?" he asked warily when I asked him to come. "I talked to Bobby about it," I said. Robert F. Kennedy was still serving after his brother's assassination as U.S. Attorney General under President Johnson. He directed me to Burke Marshall, head of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. Both understood the risk I was taking. In Mississippi's vicious climate, the chances of a Klansman taking a pot shot at me were actually pretty high. Knocking off that rich Negro singer from New York who thought that he knew what was best for the South, 10 points. Marshall heard me out on the phone and took down my itinerary. I conveyed all this to Sidney, maybe presuming a bit more from my conversation with Marshall than I should have. "Marshall's on it," I told him. "That means federal security, every step of the way." "Every step of the way," Sidney echoed. "Right," I said. "Besides, it'll be harder for them to knock off 2 black stars than 1. Strength in numbers, man." "Okay," Sidney said grimly. "But after this, Harry?" "Yeah? Never call me again." I knew Sidney well enough to know he meant it, at least at that moment. Of course, I chose to view his fury as a joke and laughed it off, but I laughed alone. Unaccompanied and not making much conversation, the 2 of us boarded a plane in Newark, New Jersey, bound for Jackson, Mississippi. I deposited the fundraiser checks and replaced them with cash, so we had $70,000 in small bills stuffed into a small doctor's bag. In that long ago time, no one asked us what we were carrying. A flight attendant just waved us aboard. Our flight to Jackson was the evening's last one, into the main airport. We found Jim Foreman and 2 other SNCC volunteers waiting for us, but otherwise the terminal sat virtually deserted. The only sign of local authority we saw was a black maintenance man pushing a broom. Sidney shot me an angry glance. That's our federal security? Probably an FBI agent in disguise, I told him. Sidney didn't so much as chuckle. The volunteers led us into the heavy, humid Mississippi night and over to a private strip beside the airport, where a little Cessna was waiting. The pilot, who was white, greeted us most soberly with a deep southern accent. As we piled in, I stole another look at him. Was he a Klansman, leading us into a trap? He sure seemed to fit the role. My fears deepened as the tiny plane flew toward Greenwood. It was a bumpy ride. The pilot seemed unconcerned. We took every pitch of the plane as the beginning of the end. Finally, we landed on a dirt runway beside a shack that constituted Greenwood's airport. The pilot taxied past it, then back, let us out, and took off immediately. What did he know that we didn't? I looked around, struck as much by the darkness as by the heat. I'd never seen a night as black as this. A poem called The Creation by James Weldon Johnson came back to me. Far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. 2 more SNCC volunteers were waiting for us with 2 cars to take us into town. Sidney and I slid into the back of one with Jim Foreman in the passenger seat and a young SNCCer named Willie Blue in the driver's seat. The rest got into the second car. Both cars had been sanded to a dull finish so they wouldn't shine at night. A good precaution, but not good enough. As Willie and the other driver started their engines, a long row of headlights flashed on at the far end of the dark airfield. That must be the federal agents, I said to Sidney. But we could see that the pairs of headlights were at different heights, and they blazed with different degrees of brightness. Willie Blue dashed my hopes. Agents my ass, he muttered, that's the Klan. Instead of driving away from the row of headlights in the direction of the main road to town, Willie and the other drivers started moving at full speed toward them. We got close enough to see the dim outlines of 3 or 4 old pickup trucks. Then, as if at some prearranged signal, Willie and the other driver veered off to the side, taking a rough alternate route to the road that led to town. The pickups fell in line behind us. Why aren't you driving faster? I shouted. Willie was keeping right to the 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. Faster, man. No, Willie shouted back. That's exactly what they want us to do. They got a state trooper up there waiting in his car with the headlights off, ready to arrest us for speeding. He takes us to the station, lets us out in about an hour, and even more of the Klan be waiting for us. That's how they work. That's how those boys got killed. From behind us, the first pickup truck sped up and started to pass us. Through the rear window, we could see it had a 2x4 across its grill, a makeshift battering ram, and no license plate. Willie swerved into the middle of the 2-lane road to keep the pickup from pulling alongside. Now the pickup started ramming the back of our car. We can't let them pull up beside us, Willie shouted. They'll shoot. Willie switched on his walkie-talkie and radioed the SNCC office in Greenwood. From the other walkie-talkie, I heard a crackling voice. We're on our way. The pickup truck kept ramming our car, but Willie stayed doggedly to the center of the road, edging left every time the truck tried to pull up. Finally, after 2 or 3 terrifying minutes, it seemed like forever, I looked down the road to see a convoy of cars coming toward us from Greenwood. That's them, Willie said. The SNCC brigade to the rescue. My heart was still pounding, but I started to breathe again. As the convoy approached, the pickup truck slowed, and their headlights retreated. That was when we heard the shots, a dozen or more. Whether the Klansmen were firing at us, or shooting up in the air, we couldn't tell. No one was hit, and no bullets pierced our cars. When we turned off the main road, secure now among the SNCC fleet, we looked back to see the pickups rolling off down the main road, with more gunfire as they went. The convoy led us into Greenwood and beyond, to an Elks Hall, where hundreds of volunteers were gathered. They had spent the day in heated debate, tense and tired, over what their next move should be. Most of their options depended on us. When Sidney and I walked in, screams of joy went up from the crowd. Sidney and I had heard a lot of applause in our day, but never anything like those cheers. After weeks of lonely, scary field work, those volunteers were wrung out and in despair. To have 2 of the biggest black stars in the world walk in to show solidarity with them, that meant a lot to them and to us. The crowd took up a freedom song and then another, the spirituals that had given these brave volunteers comfort and encouragement day after day. Finally, Sidney spoke. I'm 37 years old, he told the crowd. I have been a lonely man all my life because I have not found love, but this room is overflowing with it. Then Sidney turned to me. I let a pause fall over the room, then sang out, Day-o! The crowd picked it up with a roar. The Banana Boat song was my musical signature, but more than that, it was a cry from the heart of poor workers, a cry of weariness mingled with hope, both of which those volunteers felt profoundly that night. Day-O, Day-O, had also been turned into a civil rights anthem. Freedom, freedom, freedom coming, it won't be long. When the crowd had sung both versions, I held up the black satchel I'd brought, overturned it on the table in front of me, and let the bundles of cash cascade out to delirious shouts. As Sidney had said, we felt a lot of love in that barn. Outside it, though, Ku Klux Klanners sat in idling cars. We could hardly keep them out of Greenwood. That day, planes had flown overhead, dropping KKK leaflets that urged Mississippians not to let the niggers steal their rights. Late that night, after a dinner of chicken and spare ribs, Sidney and I were escorted to the house where we were to sleep, with armed guards patrolling outside. Our bedroom had one double bed, not too big a double bed either, shoved up against a wall under a window. Sidney blanched. Look, I'll take the inside, okay, I told him, meaning the side by the wall. I meant it as a concession. I'd be the one scrunched in by my snoring bedmate. Sidney gave me a suspicious look. Yeah, but if someone sticks a gun through that window and shoots, I'll be more apt to get hit. He was only half joking. Okay, I'll take the outside, I said. Sidney thought about that. If I was willing to take the outside, maybe it was the better side after all. No, I'll take the outside, he said. If you do get shot, I'd hate to have to climb over your dead ass to get to the door. In bed with the lights out, we talked for a while. I told Sidney some of my ghost stories. Finally, I fell into a ragged sleep, only to be awakened in the pitch darkness by a strange rasping sound. I reached over to nudge Sidney awake. The other side of the bed was empty. The rasping sound was louder. Sidney? Yes, he rasped. What the fuck are you doing? Push-ups, Sidney said. I can't sleep, and when those motherfuckers come for us, I want to be sure I'm ready. Often in the days after I got home to my wife and children, I asked myself why I had taken on the civil rights movement as my personal crusade. I knew the reason I'd gotten involved in general. Any black American with a pulse and a conscience had done that by the summer of 1964, at least to the extent of writing the occasional check. A lot of white Americans had too. All of us sensed this was a point at which history simply had to turn. We couldn't tolerate more lynchings and beatings. We couldn't abide more whites-only signs on the hotels and restaurants and gas stations, water fountains, and bus stations of the segregated South. We couldn't let black Americans be treated as slaves in all but name anymore. This we knew. But why did I feel so personally offended, sitting in my 21-room apartment on West End Avenue, when I saw news pictures of student protesters beaten by truncheon-wielding state police and bitten by police attack dogs? What deep wellspring of anger did those images bring up? And why had I felt so angry for so long about so many other related issues of freedom and democracy and equality, as if the perpetrators of those grave indignities, from the president to the FBI to the military to the man in the street, had set out to do me wrong? And why, when I also cared so much about making a success of myself as an actor and singer, had I jeopardized, in some ways damaged, that career trajectory that had made me at 30 the world's first so-called black matinee idol? My mother had a lot to do with it. To a lesser degree, my father, but he was in there. I also knew that from childhood I'd occupied a lonely place, not just between West Indian and American culture, but between black and white. And in both the actual worlds I'd balanced between as a kid, Kingston and Harlem. I was as poor could be. I was definitely angry about that. Long after I'd immersed myself in the civil rights movement, I would still be trying to understand that anger and make it melt away. With Martin Luther King Jr. to guide me, I would embrace nonviolence, not just as an organizing tactic, but as a way of life. Half a century of Freudian analysis would help too. But as I began to set down the story of my life, I would still be piecing the parts together. I know more now than when I started this book. I see the little boy I was in all his complexities, angry and hurt, almost always alone. Yet why this little boy, among all others, should use his anger to push himself up, make a name for himself, and then make it his mission to smash racial barricades and injustice with such grim determination, I'm not sure I can say. Perhaps in the end, where your anger comes from is less important than what you do with it. As most of you probably knew before I started that chapter, Harry Belafonte was in the 50s one of the most incandescent singing stars. He was the first entertainer to sell a million copies of an album. He did some acting, but then in about 1960, just as John Kennedy became president, he made a decision that he would be as immersed in civil rights as in entertainment, if not more. And so began the whole second period of his life, when he did become very close to Martin Luther King, when he played a pivotal role, really, in the civil rights movement, not only as a great champion and you know, fundraiser or writer of checks, but sometimes providing money at times and in degrees that actually affected how history turned out. And possibly that chapter I read was an example of that. It's very possible that without that money, the whole Mississippi Freedom Summer might not have gone to the fairly successful finish it did. So, to me, the fun of this chapter, the obvious choice of it as the first chapter, was that it was dramatic. You know, I think it grabbed you from the start, and you realize there's a drama, there's a challenge, there's a clock. You know, movie people are always saying, "Where's the clock?" Well, 72 hours to get this money. They do it on their own, and then you've got, 2 stars instead of 1 with Sidney Poitier and you realize that there's this wonderful friendship that is part of his life, and by the time the chapter is over, you've learned about a dozen different things about Harry Belafonte. That he was a great entertainer, that he was passionate about civil rights, that he was between 2 cultures, between Jamaica and America, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a great gift to realize that this section in his life could open up the book by giving you all those strands in one story. And hopefully getting you to want to read the second chapter, which is the ultimate test of a money chapter. So I think maybe since you guys are all writers and book writers, or hoping to be book writers, I'll skip back to my first book and then I'll work my way up to the Harry book. And in some ways, the Harry book is less instructive to you than the other books, because it was a collaboration, because I was lucky to get it. I didn't do anything in particular to get it. There's no lesson about how to get it. I happen to know someone who was the editor of the book, and he threw my hat in the ring, and I got it. And the the experience of writing this book with him was instructive if you're going to do collaborations, but maybe not as instructive as what I learned on my earlier books. So the first book that I did was a biography of a writer named Irwin Shaw, who actually lived out in the Hamptons for the last years of his life. Great character. And this was serendipity as well, I have to admit. A woman I knew said, gee, Irwin died a couple years ago. I was his longtime girlfriend, she said, and no one's writing his biography. Why don't you do it? I was 30 years old. I was a young journalist in New York. And I thought, that's a great idea. And then I went off to find out who Irwin Shaw was. And because I had no idea. And the more I read of his stories and novels, the more admiring I was. I really, really liked him. And the more I learned about his life, the more I thought it really would make a great story. Poor kid from Brooklyn who, with sheer talent and moxie, kind of writes a play at 23 that sets Broadway on fire and goes on to write great stories for the New Yorker. Then a fantastic World War II novel, The Young Lions, based on his own very dramatic war experiences, etc. Plus, he'd known all these fantastic people, from William Styron and Peter Matheson, George Plimpton, to all sorts of others. So I wrote a little proposal, and I got a modest contract, and then at the suggestion of my friend, who was very pleased to sort of be my mentor, she said, well, this will be easy. You just go to Irwin's widow and say, here you are, here I am. So I did. I called her up and I said, great news, I've gotten this contract to write write a book about your late husband. And she basically, hung up on me. And by now, she had learned that my mentor was the other woman. So this was really bad. And she actually wrote a letter to about 50 of her friends telling them not to talk to me. So I think had I not already gotten the first chunk of the modest advance, I would have just abandoned it. But I felt I couldn't. So on a sort of flyer, I just called the man that I admired more than any other biographer, Robert Caro. And if you have not read The Power Broker, you must. So I called him up and said, you don't know me, but I got this challenge. I'm supposed to write this book, and I've been told that no one's going to talk to me, and could you give me some advice? So he very kindly invited me to his very nice club in New York, and we sat in wing chairs by the window as if in some New Yorker cartoon. And he said, well, the whole thing is the papers. Do you have the papers? And I said, what papers? And he said, well, all the papers, the archives, the letters, all that stuff. And I said, no, I don't have any of that. And he was very sympathetic, enough to, I guess, not discourage me altogether. And I just started calling people, and I don't think that there was any brilliant strategy to it, but one thing I began to realize is that people actually wanted to talk. They loved Irwin. Some of them felt he was sort of a tragic character. They wanted to talk about that too. And once I got to the first 10 people, they all gossiped with each other, and the word went out, and I got to virtually everyone except the widow. In fact, there's only one other person I didn't get to, and that was Swifty Lazar, the agent. And weirdly enough, after my book came out, I got this call from Swifty Lazar. And he said, kid, you did a great job. Coming out to California, write my book. I'll give you $100,000. So, all right. And I went out to California, and he put me up in a hotel. And for several weeks, I went up to his Beverly Hills hilltop house and interviewed him. And, he had those trademark glasses, but he actually didn't wear those around the house. He knew that was, a shtick. And I realized when I started in with him that I was not the first person to be doing this, that actually 2 or 3 other writers had done this before me. And each file of the anecdotes got less rich and colorful as it went to the next. Basically, Swifty was getting older. And so I did my best. I got all the anecdotes I could. I tried to, get more color and detail on the ones that he'd already told 100 times. And I went back to write the first couple hundred pages. And only in retrospect did I realize I had made one very bad mistake. I had not cultivated his wife. Should you ever be on a biography of anybody who's got a partner, it's good advice, cultivate the partner. So I didn't do that, and I wrote the first couple hundred pages, and I thought, Swifty really, he's got this elegant life in Beverly Hills. He hangs out with the Rothschilds in Paris, but really, he's this scrappy guy from Brooklyn whose father was a butter and egg truck guy. And that's what's so great about him. I will write in his real voice. So I turned in the 200 pages to the editor, Michael Korda, who was famous for reading everything within 12 hours. And the next morning I got a call, and he said, Michael, this is a disaster. First of all, Swifty's wife hates this. And second of all, Swifty hates it because you made him sound like some guy from Brooklyn. He wants to be the guy who hobnobs with the Rothschilds. And so I got fired from that. Anyway, I didn't actually want to write another literary biography, or do a collaboration, because one thing I had learned about literary biographies, and this is a useful lesson, is that they tend to get a lot of attention from critics, because critics are writers and they like to review literary biographies. They don't sell very well. And I mean, maybe Truman Capote sells because full of scandal, but basically literary biographies don't sell. And I wasn't really interested in doing a collaboration ever again, actually. So I started just looking for a subject that would engage me. And I spent a couple of years at it. And I am here to say that certainly the idea is maybe the hardest part of book writing, because you need to find an idea that's big enough that a publisher would get excited, yet no one else is doing it. Somehow it's an idea that's going to keep or grow in the way you want it to grow. Very hard, really the hardest part of writing. I finally found an idea that I thought was pretty compelling. This was in the early 90s. General Motors was starting this electric car program. And it was exciting and kind of bizarre that GM, the conventional big three car maker, was going to do this electric car. And it turned out it involved all these interesting characters, young, sort of scruffy, brilliant engineers who'd somehow gotten inside GM and were doing this prototype. Anyway, I wrote a little proposal, and I got a modest advance again. And then I called GM and I said, well, sort of like before, I said, great, here I am. And they said, well, we don't let reporters in to our, it's called the green door. Nobody goes beyond the green door, GM. And I said, well, let me come out and talk anyway. We'll just, So I happened to find a sympathetic publicity woman who saw the sense of trying to boost this program, because it was not popular in the rest of GM. They like internal combustion engines. And so one thing led to another, and I ended up being allowed to come to the program and sit in on meetings and interview all the engineers. It was great. By the way, I know nothing about cars or about electricity. I just thought it was a cool subject. So I learned a lot, and one thing about writing nonfiction books is it's amazing how much you can learn and then forget. I actually have no idea what's in that book. No idea. But at the time, it filled my brain pan. And the only trouble with following a story like that is that it may take a turn that you didn't expect. And in this case, the turn was that GM went bankrupt, and the car program was dead. So I was very disconsolate for a while. And then, amazingly, GM came back, and the car program came back. So this was great luck. And I resumed going to Detroit and interviewing engineers. And the car came out. It's called the EV1. Came out about 1996, and my book came out in 1996. And it was a good book, if I do say so myself. And I did everything right. And then the car died, and the book died. And as some of you may know, there was a documentary made called "Who Killed the Electric Car?" That was about the EV1. They actually recalled those cars from the people. They only leased them. They didn't sell them because they wanted control. They hauled them back, I think because they just got cold feet about the whole idea, and they crushed them. And certainly my ambitions were crushed on that book. But it was a lesson, and the lesson is that, if you're going to write a book, a nonfiction book about a situation which is unfolding, be prepared for it to unfold in some way that you didn't expect and that won't actually be very useful to you. Actually, the truth is I've been very lucky. The fact that the program went up, it went down, it went up, that's basic structure there, right? Up, down, up. I was proud of the book. I was happy to have done it. I didn't want to write another book about cars. I didn't want to write I didn't really want to write another book about something that was unfolding in real time. I did get drawn into a book about drug-resistant bacteria because I had a friend who was a scientist, and he said, this is a great subject that no one's written a book about, and it's about the global threat of drug-resistant bacteria in hospitals, how people go into hospitals and they end up getting these bacteria that are resistant to all antibiotics. And it's really fascinating. I knew nothing about bacteria or medicine or anything. and I started reading about it, and it was pretty cool. So I once again wrote a proposal. This was actually the one time I got a really good advance, but I had to split it with him because he was now my partner, and the deal was that he would be the scientist and I would be the writer. So we got this big advance and we split it. And in the first week or so, I said, okay, so Mark, so I'll tell you what, you fill me in on microbiology, and then I will like interpret it for the layman here and start reading some other stuff. And there's this long pause, and he said, you know, I took some microbiology in Harvard, but honestly, I haven't thought about it for the last 25 years. I said, right, but this is, microbiology is what this is. As it turned out, Mark was kind of a cheerleader, but actually not much of a scientist, and he was an ethnobotanist, which, as I learned, is it's like science light at best. So I wrote the whole book, and it was a very interesting experience. I learned a lot, forgot a lot, and Mark got half the money. So that's another good lesson, though, actually, for you, that doing a book with someone is hard. I'm not talking about a collaboration where there's like the star and you write his book. I mean, where two writers are actually together. There are actually very few examples of that working out really well. One would be, Is Paris Burning? You know, I've forgotten their names, but you probably know them. Anyway, those guys stayed fond of each other, and I think they did another book together. It's just very difficult, you know, egos and everything else gets in the way. I would just, as a basic rule, advise against it. So now I was determined not to do another literary biography, not to do a book about cars, not to work with somebody, and not to do a book that unfolded in real time. Well, I ended up doing another book that unfolded in real time because I was drawn to a subject through an article I wrote for Vanity Fair about the Bush administration and its environmental policies, which in 2003 were really pretty disastrous. And one of the worst cases of it was this phenomenon called mountaintop coal mining or mountaintop removal. I went down to West Virginia, southern West Virginia, to something called the Coal River Valley. I was just stunned by what I saw. You know, they were blowing off these mountaintops and turning these lovely green sawtooth landscape into, you know, what looked like the Grand Canyon. And the people's whole world was being blown away. And I became very inspired by a lawyer down there, an environmental lawyer named Joe Lovett, and also by some local grassroots activists who are doing a terrific job. And one thing I realized is that in any environmental story, there's always the activists and the lawyers. It's interesting. You can't have one without the other. You know, the activists at a certain point have got to go to court, and the lawyer actually needs what they call standing. I mean, they actually need people who are out there who are willing to be plaintiffs. So it's funny how that goes together, and I find that very interesting. And I also found a villain in a guy named Don Blankenship, who was the head of Massey Energy, who became quite a national figure in the years after that. So I loved doing that book. I loved the characters. I did follow it for 2 or 3 years. I would go down there. That's a whole sort of discussion in yourself, how you write a book about a subject that's unfolding in another place. You know, obviously it would be nice to live in the place you're writing about all the time. And at first I thought, like when I did the car book, that if I wasn't in Detroit all the time, I'd miss all the good stuff. But what I realized is actually that doesn't happen. The opposite happens. If you're in a place, you get inundated by all that stuff, and then the sort of daily minutia, you know, drowns you. Whereas if you actually go back every 3 months to a place, and you're following a few things and a few people, you know, what's most important will have remained in their minds and in the news, and you can write about it and not get overwhelmed by the material. So in that sense, it wasn't too hard to do the mountaintop coal removal book. But like the car book, it was one that depended on events unfolding in a way that was useful and good. Once again, I would say I got really lucky in terms of the way that Joe Lovett brought his lawsuits and then appealed them, and then they were defeated on appeal, and then he went back. It was again a sort of nice shape to the narrative. I chose to end it at a certain point where I really just needed to finish the book. And one thing I realized is that I could have stayed down there for the next 5 years, and there's some subjects that don't really end, and sadly that's true of most environmental subjects. They keep going. Pretty rare that things get really sewn up tight and solved or resolved. So I loved writing that book, but once again, it was a book that got a lot of nice reviews and didn't sell that many copies. And while I loved doing it, I have to admit that I was in effect preaching to the converted. And if you are, writing a sort of environmental book, or really a book about any sort of social issue, this is a problem. How do you actually get beyond the crowd of 100 people who are already on your side? It's very frustrating. And in this country, it's the more balkanized we get politically, the harder it is to get beyond your own little fiefdom politically. And one of the few places that really blasts through every sector of the population is 60 Minutes. I mean, wow, when something's on 60 Minutes, it really affects things. But a book, that gets read by 5,000 or 10,000 people, not so much so. So it's just a bittersweet reality of the book writing business. Okay, well that brings me up to Harry, and I guess I would just say this, that I didn't expect to get the book. I was sure that he would choose a black writer. There were a couple other writers, and at least one of them was black. And when he did choose me, I felt a little, I was pleased, of course, and proud, but also a little shy. I thought, well, how am I going to write in the voice of this black guy who's, also a different generation than I am, and in a whole different world of civil rights that I didn't know much about at that point. And so we started talking. The first time, he lives on the Upper West Side, and that was great. He's not in Hollywood or something, so it was very easy to go in and start meeting with him. And the first time we sat down, I asked the question that Robert Caro had asked me. I said, "So where are the papers?" And he said what I had said. "What papers?" He had no papers. By the way, Irwin Shaw hadn't had any papers either, it turned out. He was not one of these great letter writers, so it really didn't matter. And it didn't really matter that much with Harry. Harry said what biography subjects, I guess, also often say to their collaborators: "Don't worry, it's all in my head." And that is usually, those are usually chilling words, because it's usually not in their heads. But actually, it was in his head, and it was unbelievable. He started talking, and he just was an amazing storyteller, a passionate storyteller. He also didn't speak too fast, which was really good, because I did the whole thing on my laptop. I'm determined not to tape anybody anymore and have to transcribe tapes. I've done enough of that in my life. So I just sat there like a stenographer, typing as he talked, and after the first few times I wrote a first chapter. I didn't write the money chapter. I didn't know about that until we got well into the process, and then realized I'd put it up front. So you're just starting, from the beginning with his early childhood, his parents and whatnot. And I wrote a first chapter, and I gave it to him and to his wife Pam, who, by the way, I knew to cultivate. She's actually a wonderful woman. And I gave it to him with a lot of trepidation. I assumed that, it would not feel right to him. And he read it, and Pam read it, and they loved it. And I thought, well, yeah, but I didn't say this, but I thought, this is more me than you, Harry. I mean, it's your stories, and as much as I can, I'm using your language, but boy, I got to fill in with a lot of my own words. And you know, it's almost like, are they white words and yours are black words? And, you know, but of course, no, it all kind of worked together because it was, you know, just basically smooth prose that had his stories and the, you know, when there was a word that he used a lot, I made sure to use it. For instance, he loved this word jingle. And jingle is money. You know, he said, "Oh, I got out of the war, I didn't have a lot of jingle." And so I always used that when I could. And space was another word he liked. You know, he's not in my space. You know, I'm not in his space. So I used that when I could. But the truth is that unless you have a really neurotic subject that you're collaborating with, there's a sort of forgivability factor, you know, of 20 or 30%. You can write somewhat in your own words, using his as much as you can, and come up with something which might be, you know, 60% you and 40% him, and it's okay. He'll think it's 100% him. In fact, believe me, by the end of the process, he'll think he did the whole book. And this is, in fact, a truism of this kind of book writing. It's actually quite amazing. Harry is a fantastic guy, and I love him dearly. And he did this far less than I think most subjects do. The editor of this book, Peter Gathers, who lives in Sag Harbor, was also the editor of the Barbara Walters book. And let's just say that Barbara Walters really thought she wrote her book from early on. Harry only at the sort of end, you know, I'd written everything. He said, "Oh, wait a minute, let me sort of get my fingers on this." And then he started, you know, going over it much more, well, really for the first time, kind of going over it line by line, page by page. And, you know, his changes were all good. I mean, they were important to him. They weren't necessarily changes that, you know, improved the syntax or the grammar, but I could always smooth that in. And it was fine. I mean, there was a bit of torture at the end. I think it would be fair to say. You know, though I never asked him this, I think that, you know, by doing that, he did kind of make that spiritual leap to think that it was his book with a little help from me, and that's fine. That's forgivable. That's, you know, human nature. And if you're going to do this kind of book, you better be ready for it. There are other things I can tell you about trying to make a living as a writer and stuff like that Susan wants me to talk about. But maybe I'll just pause here and ask if there's anything in particular you want to ask or direction you'd like me to go, because this is just a class and we can go any direction you'd like. Any thoughts, Stan? Yeah.
Michael, you read this opening chapter and then you kind of went through the story of your writing. But this chapter, as moving as it is, the detail, the words, the sentences, it was almost as if we were listening to a journal that was written contemporaneously. And then as you recount, you were writing his story, you're trying to get his voice in your voice, but he didn't have the papers. He wasn't writing that journal.
That's right.
So was it that his memory really was that clear, or was there poetic license for you to create drama?
Well, that's a very good question.
Well, thank you.
No, it is, because, you know, the sort of alchemy by which you take someone's stories and then kind of fill them out in the way you suggested is definitely kind of central to this process. I would say that Harry probably gave me at least 60 to 70% of that story, but I certainly then did some research to, you know, I mean, he didn't remember what day it was in June that or August that what day in June the civil rights activists, 3 volunteers had vanished, which day they had been found dead, that it was in Philadelphia, Mississippi. You know, lots of little details like that are frankly very easy to find now online. I mean, there's no great science to it. In fact, I don't think I could have done this book this is, by the way, kind of a big book. This is almost 200,000 words. I wrote this in about a year and a half. One reason I could do that quickly was because I could meet with Harry often. He was very generous with his time. But another reason is because of the internet, because I could just, instantly fill in the facts. Now, of course, you have to be careful with that. Sometimes I would go to Google and see a listing for something and just say, oh, that's it, and put it in without even opening the page. And, sometimes those Google listings are kind of not what they seem to be when you're looking at the listing. There's a difference between the listing and the page. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're posted by people who, aren't authorities on a subject. So you certainly need a few backups, but I would say that, I would say this too, that it's not just Google searches. It certainly is reading some books on the subject. I mean, the great thing about Harry's life was that, there was the whole period in the late 40s and 50s where he was going from being a completely poor Navy veteran, pushing racks of clothes in the city for $40 a week in the garment district, to being a great singer. Well, there were books to read about that time. It was a wonderfully rich, colorful time of jazz clubs and the singers, and Nat King Cole, or on the other hand, Elvis Presley, all these people he met, and what I could always read about them that way. And then the civil rights era, there are some wonderful books. The best book is, of course, the trilogy by Taylor Branch, which actually there's a little lesson in that. That's like 3,000 pages, and if I had read that whole trilogy, which at one point I set out to do, I would have drowned in it. Sometimes a short book is much more useful than a long book. So I had a bookshelf of books on the civil rights movement, and I certainly turned to those when I was writing that first chapter and others. And then when I needed to get really deep down, I would turn to Taylor Branch, and he would tell me what happened at 4 o'clock on June 22nd, 1963. And so that could be helpful too. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question. Yeah.
At what level of vaingloriousness in your subject do you draw the line in being their, like public relations doppelganger? Like Swifty Lazar, right?
Yeah.
You talked about his penniless childhood, and now he hangs out with sluts. He doesn't want to know about the past.
Right.
That's like a Ralph Lauren store. It's the past
Right.
it's you never had becomes part of your present.
Right. Well, I think, obviously it depends on your subject's ego.
Well, that's what I mean, or lack of it.
I mean, Harry has an ego for sure, but it's a very benevolent ego. He's not trying to suck up all the airspace or diminish you, which many people with big egos are trying to do. He can listen. He can take an interest in someone, and he's also, although he's justifiably very, very proud of his accomplishments, he does not in any way shy away from the abject poverty, the very tough stuff that he faced with both his parents, with their drinking and their fighting, and all this stuff. It helped in his case that he had gone to analysis for really for like 50 years. He'd really come through all these things in a way that made him a superb storyteller and hugely helpful to me. So, I mean, that's the answer. It depends on you. I would hate to be in a situation where someone just wants you to polish their statue. I mean,
Trump's biographer, right?
Yeah, that's no fun. Yeah.
I'm curious, when you began the collaboration process, if you had to suspend, if it's possible for you as a writer to suspend whatever your prior impression of Belafonte was, and in the process of interviewing him, whether that image was affirmed or altered by the interaction.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I didn't have too much of an impression of him. I had a sort of vaguely, benign, admiring sense of him. But I'm 57. You know, I was a little young to have ridden the Belafonte wave. I mean, really, you know, to have done that in the 50s, you'd have to be now 65 or 70 even. I mean, so, you know, I think I approached it without any particular attitude. And once again, as with the Irwin Shaw biography, I was fortunate enough to be, you know, hooked up to someone who was really quite wonderful and fascinating. And you know, I don't know what would have happened if I'd started reading Irwin's stories and I hadn't liked them. I don't think I could have proceeded. I think if Harry had turned out to be, you know, a very arrogant guy, I don't know, I might have gritted my teeth and just gone through it to get through, but maybe not, because you really do have to put your heart into these things, and it's pretty hard to do that when you don't like the subject. In fact, I would just say this, that I realize, sort of only in retrospect, that that I really just like writing books about people that I admire, which is not true for everybody. I mean, you know, there are people who write wonderful books about murders. You know, I think In Cold Blood is one of the best books ever written. There are people who write, you know, sort of investigative takedowns of shoddy politicians and stuff like that. I can like reading them, and I can admire them, but I don't really want to spend 2 or 3 years of my life with someone that I dislike or some creepy situation. I just, you know, life's too short. So that somewhat by serendipity, I ended up writing books about people that in each case I really admired, whether it was Irwin Shaw as a writer, the engineers at GM who were terrific, the scientists trying to stop drug-resistant bacteria, and the environmentalists in Coal River, and then Harry. I mean, I really have enormous admiration for them all, and I would just say that, you know, that helps. So, yeah.
When you're writing someone else's stories, most often are they supplying all the anecdotes and you're just kind of culling through them and then supplying, you know, the actual writing and curving it into a narrative, or do you have to steer them sort of in the interview process?
Right. Yeah, you do have to steer them. I mean, well, I'll confess something here. On the first session that I had with Harry, I looked up at his bookshelf. He was talking, I was typing. And I saw this book that said Belafonte. And I was like, what the fuck? So I said, Harry, what is that book? And he said, terrible biography that was done back in 1960. I said, really? Can I borrow it? And it was an absolute gem, because I realized as I began reading it why he didn't like it, because his ex-wife had cooperated with the writer. So it sort of was very sympathetic toward her and then a little tough on Harry. You know, it was a book that everybody had forgotten, and but I saw it was going to be enormously useful, because this guy, who was actually a pretty good journalist, you know, it was what they call a cut and paste job, because he hadn't gotten Harry to cooperate. So he was writing this, you know, with the ex-wife, and then, you know, reading the papers at the time and cutting and pasting them and you know, putting a pretty serviceable book together. But because he had all the newspapers at the time, I could get the newspapers at the time. And because he had interviewed the wife, I got anecdotes. And then what I would do is, I wasn't using it, I wasn't plagiarizing it, God knows. I would just go to Harry and say, so, you know, at this point in your life, just as you went into the Navy, you know, this happened, right? Where you got into a fight with somebody and they put you in the brig, because that anecdote had been in that book. And, you know, it was entirely properly to take it. It was his life, right? It was his anecdote. So I just got him then to tell it in much fuller detail. So that was kind of my monarch notes. But, you know, you're right. I mean, sometimes like when I got to the civil rights stuff, I read enough about the period to know each of its, you know, turning points, and to essentially guide Harry through them, because the chances were that he had been doing something at each of those turning points, and indeed he was. He wasn't there on site all the time, but he was there a lot of it, for a lot of it, and certainly when it came to the March on Washington, he was instrumental. He actually, if anyone has a memory of all the celebrities who were there that day, he was the guy who got them there. You know, Birmingham with the children's march and the police dogs and everything, he was the guy who raised all the money and got them bailed out. I mean, so, you know, in many cases, I was fortunate enough to have historical moments that I knew he would have something to do with, and he did. So, yeah.
I'm actually writing a memoir, ghostwriting a memoir for somebody right now, and I have a problem where I tend to say yes a little more often than I should. I think, in terms of his suggestions to me and stuff that I've already written. So I guess the way that we've been structuring it is I write a certain amount, and then we meet and I show it to him, and we'll discuss it further, and then, but it turns out that he'll want to make a lot of changes that I don't necessarily agree with, just in terms of him not being a natural writer and knowing how, you know, do you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, I mean, the only advice I can give you there is, you know, I think you should sort of set up a rule, which is that, you know, he gets 2 times to look back at it and make changes, and after the second time, that's it. Or else, you know, be willing to walk away, because people can drive you nuts. I'm actually, as a favor, helping a woman who's older woman who's a fashion designer. She's got sort of an interesting memoir, life story, and I'm really just doing this as a little thing on the side for fun to help her. I'm not sure it'll get published, but I've noticed that every time I work on this first part, there are 2 reactions. First, she says, "Michael, you're just a terrific writer. You're just unbelievable. You're terrific." And the next thing is, "You know, do you know me? Do you really know me? Because I don't think you've got my voice here." And then she'll make a bunch of changes, and then I'll like put them in, smooth them so they work. So we've done that twice, and I said to her, "That's it." You know, I mean, this is an easy one to walk away from. There's no particular money yet anyway, but I think that you have to teach people, you know, not to do that. So, yeah.
I was curious, with a collaboration, do you verify the collaborators' anecdotes with outside sources? Well,
that's a very good question. I didn't do that. I probably should have. I mean, you know, in a sense, a collaboration like this is a lazy man's biography. You know, writing a biography, I never could have done this book in 2 years. It would have taken me 5, because I would have had to talk to all those people like Sidney Poitier, or, you know, Harry's second wife that he was married to for 50 years, you know, more to his children, all these people. But this was his book, you know, and the thing about a memoir, and it's interesting, memoir, autobiography, you know, when it came time to decide what to call this, there was a bit of a debate at Knopf. Yeah, I think that the conclusion was that the 2 words are pretty much interchangeable now. Certainly, in the publishing business, there's no hard line between them, and yet I think of autobiography as a more fact-filled, sort of journalistically responsible story of one's own life, whereas memoir is much more impressionistic. Could just be, you know, a memoir of growing up, or a memoir of one summer, or whatever. And a memoir also, it seems to me, gets you further off the hook of needing to do that checking, because you can always say, well, that's the way I remember it, you know, that's my story. you know, ultimately, I think it would have been better if I'd had the time to check things with people, but we had a deadline. It's also true, actually, that Harry, for the last 5 years, had been making a documentary about his life, and it sort of ended up dovetailing with the book, and he had interviewed a lot of these people for it. So I read some of those transcripts, I got some of that stuff, but you know, in the end, it was his memoir, and I'm sure there are some people in this book who feel that, you know, he didn't get their stories right. Yeah.
But isn't it in a way a memoir about the person, everybody, the celebrity especially, that everybody thinks the person is, as opposed to, you know, kind of more muckraky kind of thing? I mean, it's, you know what I mean? It's about who everybody sees that person as in general.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure I agree. I think a memoir can be anything from, you know, a puffy kind of Hollywood celebrity memoir that does just what you suggest, or it can be someone's extremely tough, bruising story of, you know, growing up with alcoholic parents. I mean, I think it covers the gamut, really. It's interesting. Memoir as a genre has been, in the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, kind of hot in publishing. I'm not sure it is now, but it certainly
I didn't mean
was.
puff piece. I meant, like, let's say, what we imagined Clint Eastwood, a guy's been, you know, to be. I mean, a memoir would really be about, or Steve McQueen even better, you know, in a strange way, you know? Like, it was about the guy in Bullet, you know, about the guy, you know, rebel motorcycle, the whole deal, you know? I mean...
Well, I think in the end it really, you know, a memoir is what you as the memoirist want to do with it. And it can be, you know, self-serving, or it can be very revealing.
I mean about the persona of the person, like what everybody, if they had to give 3 words to those 3 words.
Yeah.
Which are mostly about the same usually.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. I hadn't thought about it.
So
Yeah.
Michael, just in the interest of time, I mean, just though we could probably go on with this forever. Michael's books are over there, as are David Margolick's, and I think Michael should sign them if he feels like it.
I will sign David's, absolutely.
Thank you. This has just been absolutely wonderful and completely new take on another side of publishing for us. So I just want to thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.